What's the first thing that comes to mind when you imagine a locked door? Is it there to keep people out? Or to keep them in? Is its purpose to provide safety or isolation? Perhaps both. With that little thought experiment in mind, how might one read the subtitular room in Silent Hill 4? As a prison or a refuge? After all, when what you fear exists in the outside world, a wide open door might as well be covered in chains. The most striking thing about Apartment 302, aside from the excess of chains bolted to the front door, is ironically how bland it is. The wallpaper, the kitchen cabinets, even the window blinds share slightly different shades of the same discolored white, camouflaging the equally unexciting furniture against the walls, which are dulled further by the depressively dim lighting and grey carpet flooring. In terms of decor, Apartment 302 communicates as little as possible about its tenant, creating the perfect habitat for our protagonist, Henry Townshend. His outfit consists of a white shirt, an equally white shirt underneath,
and diesel jeans.
This is the look of someone who deliberately attempts to not pull any attention to themselves, someone who wouldn't even know what to do with that attention if they got it. Further, these appear to be the only items of clothing he owns, and the only other pair of shoes he wears often enough to place by the front door are no more vibrant than the shoes he's already wearing. A closer examination of the apartment reveals that Henry is a photographer, though it's unclear whether it's his profession or a recreational hobby. What is certain is that he isn't exactly imaginative when it comes to picking subjects for his work. A lighthouse he saw while vacationing in Silent Hill, a bike, and the exterior of his own apartment building? Taking such a photo is one thing, but hanging it on your wall is the biggest telltale sign that you need to get out and see more of the world. Henry's living room is also decorated with the image of a generic city skyline, provided by the superintendent, as well as two photos of Henry himself. One from his early childhood, and one from his high school graduation. One can see other people in at least one of these photos, although Henry makes no comments about either of them. They are as camouflaged in this image as the surrounding furniture. Moving to the kitchen, you'll find the fridge empty, except for some chocolate milk and a bottle of wine. Now, Henry could have cleared the contents of his fridge in the 5 days he's been stuck in the apartment by the start of the game. Though given what we've already been able to glean about Henry's character, purely through his dilapidated surroundings, it's curious that these are the specific items the developers allow you to interact with. Henry isn't necessarily an alcoholic, but the implication is that when he drinks, he does it alone. When approaching the stove, Henry monologues that he doesn't feel like cooking. Not that he can't due to a lack of food, suggesting that maybe he doesn't have much of an appetite these days, nor does he have a desire to pick up after himself. The stained fixtures in the bathroom are no more inviting, the hard water-stained tub being the clear standout. This could easily be explained away as a simple aesthetic trick, to make the apartment appear more appropriately haunted. I mean, has there ever been such a thing as a clean bathtub in a horror game? Though hopefully, you're starting to notice a theme building up about how Henry views his surroundings. Of course there's no one in the bathtub. Yeah, Henry, that's the notable thing about this picture. Henry is, if you couldn't already tell, a peculiar person. His demeanor is drowsy. He emotes pretty much the same way, whether he's just gotten out of bed.
Oh, man.
Or found someone dying in a pool of their own blood.
Are you okay?
Henry's neighbors know each other well enough to stop and talk in the hallway, though the only thing they collectively know about Henry is his name and what number hangs on his front door. On the rare occasion he does speak to someone, it's clear he's a man of very few words. More often than not, he simply repeats and replies to what others are saying, rather than contribute his own thoughts and observations. That is, if he chooses to say anything at all.
Get me out. Get me the hell out of here.
Thank you for calling Henry Townshend. Unfortunately, his brain is quite turned off at the moment.
On the surface, none of this seems like it would lend itself particularly well to a rounded character with whom you will spend a significant chunk of time. That said, what one might perceive as a lack of character proves deceptive. Contrary to how it may initially appear, Henry is the perfect vessel for this story, his defining characteristic being that he is an introvert rather than an extrovert, with most of what the player learns about him coming from his inner thoughts, rather than his outward proclamations to others. This certainly makes him different from other Silent Hill protagonists, but not worse. While James and Heather are forced to deal with their external struggles by looking inward, Henry is forced to deal with his internal struggles by looking outward.
Mechanically, Apartment 302 serves as a classic survival horror safe room. The player can save their progress and relieve their limited inventory of any unneeded items. If Henry has taken any damage before returning to the apartment, simply sticking around for a bit will actually refill his health bar, meaning that Silent Hill 4 is the only game in Team Silent's original quadrilogy where the main character can heal themselves without consumable items. Why is that? Well, based on Henry's nervous interactions with his neighbors, the wounds this place is healing him from might not be entirely physical in nature, but social. Anyone familiar with the Jungian concept of extroverts and introverts are likely also familiar with the idea of the social battery, that extroverted people gain energy from spending time with others, while introverts lose it. As an introvert, the most reliable way of recharging this figurative battery is to spend time alone, without feeling obligated to reach out to anyone. Paradoxically, Henry needs the safety, comfort, and isolation of the apartment for the sake of his mental health, but he also needs to escape the apartment for the sake of that same mental health. His tiredness, his unwillingness to eat or clean, his avoidance of people, they not only speak to Henry's clear introversion, but a deep depression. It's ultimately this depression, metaphorically represented by the chains on his front door, which prevents Henry from letting other people into his life. He clearly has a voyeuristic interest in other people, though. While in the apartment, Henry can be made to gaze outside any window and spy on his neighbors, as well as the passing cars and pedestrians. What's immediately apparent is that the developers at Team Silent chose to significantly reduce the detail of the character models used for all these people. They look like they belong in a game from the original PlayStation, rather than a game made 4 years after the release of the PlayStation 2. A necessary evil for the sake of hardware, perhaps. But it's arguably no less relevant or representative of Henry's perception of the world around him. These people are recognizably human, but they act and move more like mechanical puppets at an amusement park ride. They're a curiosity for Henry to amuse himself with in between the game's levels. It's difficult to see or understand exactly what some of these neighbors are supposed to be doing, reflecting Henry's own inability to connect with them. All of them, that is, except for one neighbor in particular. The previous tenant of Apartment 302, journalist Joseph Schreiber, subtle, one day found himself in the exact same predicament as Henry. He tried carving a hole into the neighboring apartment, but only managed to create a tiny peephole, which Henry can use to check up on his neighbor, Eileen. She is the polar opposite of Henry. Expressive, energetic, and certainly doesn't mind putting on an attention-grabbing outfit for a night out with friends. The game leaves it unsaid whether Henry's interest in Eileen is sexual, romantic, or strictly platonic, though there's something about her which encourages Henry to step out of his shell. And it's apparent before they've even had a chance to talk to each other. Looking through the peephole at a specific point in the game reveals Eileen watching TV. She laughs, she claps, she's having an all-around good time. Probably watching the first season of Joey.
This new agent, this lady, is a shark. And that means she's a good agent, not an actual shark.
But then, she suddenly stops and turns her head to the peephole. Arguably, she shouldn't be able to see it, but in this moment, it's like she's piercing right through, straight into Henry's eyes, straight into yours. And then, the moment passes. Eileen turns her head back to the television and resumes laughing and clapping as if nothing ever happened. But the illusion has been broken. These neighbors, they're not mere extras or props in the film of Henry's life. They are people, and they do perceive him. Spying on someone like this is inherently intrusive, no two ways about it, but it conveys the core of Henry's struggle like little else could. Henry absolutely can avoid using this people, as well as the one on his front door. He can mostly ignore what his neighbors are doing, as he seems to have done even before he was forcibly locked within apartment 302. But it's only when Henry decides to allow Eileen to see him, to connect and cooperate with him, that he's going to have a chance of getting out of his predicament alive. Some of Henry's other neighbors unfortunately don't survive long enough to learn this lesson of cooperation. You see, the reason why Henry is a literal prisoner in his own home is because a serial killer named Walter Sullivan is performing a ritual to get back to his long-lost mother. A ritual which includes murdering a whole bunch of residents of South Ashfield Heights.
Walter, you gotta do the 21 sacraments, Walter.
Henry's only means of stopping the ritual is by climbing through an ever-expanding hole in the bathroom wall, which transports him to a series of bizarro worlds, birthed from Walter's traumatizing memories. Each world, or level, contains another victim Walter has brought to slaughter, starting with a promiscuous lady named Cynthia.
I'm really thirsty.
Cynthia doesn't take the situation seriously, believing it to be nothing but a bad dream she's having, meaning that she also perceives Henry as nothing but a figment of her imagination, one she might as well use to make her supposed dream slightly more wet.
I'll do a special favor for you later.
I'm so thirsty.
They do stick together for a while. Not like that, get your mind out of the gutter! Though it's less a cooperative effort than it is Henry protecting Cynthia from any and all hostile creatures they come across. In the end, however, it's not enough. Cynthia is mortally wounded off-screen and dies in Henry's arms. He tries to comfort her by reassuring that this is indeed all a dream. A courtesy he doesn't offer to the next two victims he comes across. He barely offers a single word, in fact. And the fourth victim, Richard Braintree, now that's a last name, is armed and confident enough that he can get out of the situation all on his own. He doesn't. These neighbors, along with Walter's prior victims, return as the game's most resilient enemies. Unless you have a Sword of Obedience, of which there are only 5 in the whole game, these ghosts will stalk Henry relentlessly.
The Silent Hill series is no stranger to using humanoid creatures as enemies, but they fit especially well with Henry's social, more existential struggles. The enemies in previous entries generally have their faces heavily obscured, if they have faces at all. They are deliberately dehumanized. These enemies, however, do have discernible facial features. They have eyes that watch Henry, eyes that judge him, eyes with malicious intent. They're a threat to Henry not because of their monstrous aspect, but their lingering humanity. As pointed out by fellow essayist Cullen in his video on the game, it's curious that the sections where Henry has to face these enemies feature a third-person camera, rather than the first-person perspective found in apartment 302, as if Henry disassociates to cope with the terrors he sees in the outside world. A world where the toughest obstacle is simply being near other people. There's also evidence that this disassociation might be affecting Henry while he's in his apartment as well, since if you go back and observe his childhood photos again, he states that he used to be that young too, as if the person he's looking at is not himself.
Eileen is the only resident who miraculously survives her encounter with Walter. She's also the only neighbor who stops to have a proper, two-sided conversation with Henry. He, in turn, is clearly more relaxed in her presence than with his other neighbors. He even uses Joseph Schreiber's old research notes to concoct a plan by which Henry and Eileen can put a stop to Walter's ritual. Together. What follows is a retread of all the previous levels, but this time in the company of Eileen. Perhaps a cheap way of extending the game's runtime. But not only do the levels present new challenges this time around, they work as a great thematic contrast to the game's first half. Because again, you have company now. Despite her having a broken arm, a limp leg, and a busted eye, Eileen is not simply a helpless damsel for Henry to protect. By picking up specific weapons, Eileen is capable of protecting Henry right back. She can't strictly die during combat, though if she's left to take hits from enemies, she will gradually become possessed by Walter's supernatural influence, culminating in temporary seizures, which deal psychic damage to Henry while in her proximity. In other words, any attempts to return to Henry's socially distant ways while exploring the dream worlds with Eileen will, inevitably, come back to bite Henry, right in the diesel genes. Doing things yourself during the first half of the game might be more convenient. However, had Henry continued down that road alone, he would probably have ended up facing the same fate as his less fortunate neighbors. If you care about keeping Eileen safe during the second half, your patience will be tested, time and time again, as it often tends to be during so-called escort missions. And that is the entire point. The outcome of the game is largely determined by whether you view Eileen as a burden or a person. If you give in to frustration and start treating her carelessly, that will result in a version of Henry who is incapable of learning to let other people into his life. If you take the challenge seriously, the result is the opposite. It's by no means an easy task to overcome such things as depression or social anxiety. And the second half of Silent Hill 4 reflects that perfectly. It's not just Walter or his social anxiety that Henry has to worry about, though. At this point in the game, the ceiling fan in the living room crashes to the floor, and in the same moment, Henry no longer refills his health bar while staying here. Worse, he might end up losing health instead. The apartment will occasionally be exposed to these hauntings, which take the form of everything from banging windows to ghosts emerging from the walls. Moving too close to any of these hauntings will drain Henry's health, meaning that his only way of refilling the health bar is to actively choose to face the dangers out in Walter's dream worlds and gather recovery items. This marks a crucial turning point for Henry's character. Feeling an uninvited presence in his apartment, his social battery regains nothing from visiting it anymore. It's only when he confronts his fears, in the company of Eileen, that he has a chance of getting his strength back. This is also the point where Henry can find holy candles, items that rid the apartment of its various hauntings. Though more importantly, they teach Henry a lesson in the importance of maintaining one's surroundings. This is gonna sound very Jordan Peterson for a bit, but stick with me.
If you can't even clean up your own room, who the hell are you to give advice to the world?
Coming home to an unclean apartment, like Henry's, might fill you with a sense that you've lost control over your life. The obligation to do something about it simultaneously increases your sense of fatigue. It's fitting then that the solution in this case comes in the form of something as finite as a candle. There's no permanent solution to this problem. All you can do is take care of it one step at a time, and accept the fact that you're eventually going to have to deal with the problem again. Whether it's dirty dishes, a pile of unwashed clothes, or in this case, getting a surprise visit from a ghost in the living room wall. Every aspect of the game and how it's played seems tailor-made to convey Henry's emotional development. To contrast, the journey of the game's antagonist is about emotional degradation. I mentioned before that Walter is performing his ritual in order to get his mother back. What I didn't mention is that he allegedly believes his mother to be apartment 302 itself, since that was where he was abandoned as a baby. While he was raised at the Wish House orphanage near Silent Hill, he would make frequent visits to South Ashfield Heights, trying to re-enter 302, though he eventually learned to fear the city. He was already being indoctrinated and physically abused by the religious cult running the orphanage, and the treatment he received from the citizens of South Ashfield only fueled his antisocial behavior further. As his frustration and ambivalence towards people grew, so too did his need to isolate himself, holding apartment 302 in such high regard that he became willing to spill both his and other people's blood to quote-unquote awaken it through his ritual. He fully convinced himself that this place, this inanimate object, will provide him with a kind of love that no living human ever could. Except, maybe, the compassionate 5-year-old girl who once gifted him her favorite doll, as she found Walter sleeping on the streets. That girl was none other than Eileen, whom Walter would repay, years later, with attempted murder. Ultimately, it wasn't the act of kindness that Walter cherished, but the doll, another object. In this sense, Walter is more or less the inverse of Henry. Walter learned to loathe close to everything but the room, whereas Henry gradually learns to step out of the room and reach out to other people. One interprets the locked door as a refuge, the other as a prison. And it's at the game's conclusion, the final confrontation between Henry and Walter, that we see this dichotomy most clearly. I have previously criticized the use of multiple endings in Silent Hill 2, how they judge the actions of the main character while failing to read the player's intentions behind those actions. In Silent Hill 4, however, things are very different. Based on the player's actions, the endings run the gamut from Henry and/or Eileen dying and Walter gaining access to apartment 302 at their worst, right through Henry visiting Eileen in the hospital before returning home, which is now more dilapidated than ever. In the quote-unquote best ending, however, Eileen chuckles and says,
"Guess I'll have to find a new place to live, huh?"
And Henry nods in agreement. I find it curious that, when Eileen says this, she looks straight into the camera, implying that, in this shot, we find ourselves placed in Henry's perspective. He's now able to look Eileen in the eye, for real this time, and feel perfectly at ease. A shift in perspective that once represented Henry's disassociation is now downright heartwarming. Every single one of these endings revolve around the same core question. Just how much effort did Henry put into improving himself? The worst ending is achieved when Henry stoops to Walter's antisocial level, leaving Eileen behind at every turn, allowing himself and his apartment to fall into disarray. It's the path of self-destruction, of ignoring every hint the game places right in front of you. It's when Henry embraces the more demanding task of keeping Eileen safe, of making sure that at least the majority of the hauntings are dealt with, and following the advice left behind by Joseph Schreiber, that a happy ending is achieved, at least for those left alive. The other endings, while ultimately tragic, do offer an ounce of hope for the future, because regardless of the outcome, we're guided to the same conclusion. Henry Townshend doesn't want to be alone anymore.
There is one more thing I'd like to mention that I wasn't able to put anywhere else. There is this, I guess, somewhat popular idea that Henry Townshend is autistic, or at least that he's somewhere on the autism ADHD spectrum. While I don't have too much to say about that, I still think it's worth exploring for a bit. Because if you didn't already know, I have some first-hand experience living with ADHD. Some potential signs of autism is a limited interest in social interactions, as well as having a hard time reading social cues. Now, the difference between being so-called neurotypical and neurodivergent isn't exactly black and white. Everyone, even people who aren't autistic, may experience varying levels of relatability with multiple symptoms. You might have a hard time interpreting body language, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're autistic. You can also be autistic while having less problems with social interactions. It's called a spectrum for a reason. That said, Henry definitely exhibits some typically autistic behaviors. He's reclusive, and as we have established, not very good at talking to people. These are traits I can somewhat relate to. Though most of all, I relate to his inability to keep his apartment clean. The symptom I struggle with above all is called executive dysfunction, which includes a whole bunch of different things. Though most relevant to this topic is having trouble starting difficult, time-consuming, or straight up boring tasks. I've given Henry some shit for not taking care of his apartment, but if you knew the state of my apartment while I was writing the script for this video, you would think that I was a Twitch streamer. Then again, I was healing from a broken arm, so I think I had a somewhat decent excuse. What I find the most interesting about this reading of Henry, though, is what it implies about Eileen. You've probably heard someone say that being diagnosed with autism or ADHD is a superpower, and I'd argue that's true in a very specific way, and that is that we are very good at recognizing fellow neurodivergents. I like to compare it to how drunk people are instinctively pulled towards each other, while all the sober ones fade into the background. So if Henry is indeed autistic, I think it's reasonable to assume that the reason why Henry is drawn to Eileen in particular is because she too is on the spectrum. He is an autistic introvert, and she is an extrovert with ADHD. I mean, come on, there's nothing neurotypical about this footage. Anyway, this was supposed to be the end credits, and oh, I see, it started rolling already. Huge thanks to all the people who made this video happen by supporting me on Patreon. Here are some of their names. Onaday, Callum Wally, Chromatophorium, D.E. Wright, Duncan Scott, Eben Phantom, Emma Lynn, Franz Johannes Feulner, Håvard Klugerud, Icarus Harker, Jesse Earl, Kalis, L. Tantavi, Lesser Sage of Stars, Losty, Nicole, Quillightful, Rowan Woodcock, Sable Cow, Sethsard, Silkmoth, TB Skyan, 10 Tiny Kittens, and Vinders. I also want to thank Hot Cider for the thumbnail, Game Servatory for creating the fantastic intro sequence, Daniel Santos, Pixel a Day, and Hamish of the YouTube channel Writing on Games for editing and giving very solid advice on the script. Hamish does professional script editing on the side, so if you yourself have a script in need of some extra eyes, I highly recommend paying for his services. And lastly, I want to thank Kevin from the Pixel It podcast for providing his best Mike Ehrmantraut impression. And that's it for now.
Dad was such a drag.